Pazzo Nico had buried a lot of secrets in his 63 years, but the one standing in his doorway wore sneakers with holes in the toes and carried a photograph that should have burned 20 years ago. The back room of Santoro's social club smelled like espresso, cigar smoke, and old money. Dark wood walls bore scars from decades of whispered deals and unspoken threats. A single ceiling fan turned slowly overhead, pushing warm air across 8 men who ruled different corners of New York's underworld with nothing more than their names and reputations. They were capos, not soldiers, not associates, but men whose phone calls could shut down entire streets. At the head of the table sat Pazzo Nico himself. Silver streaked his hair now, but his posture hadn't softened with age. His eyes were sharp, calculating. The eyes of a man who had buried enemies and brothers alike and learned to live with both. The sleeves of his tailored suit were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with ink that told stories most people would never hear. Poker chips clicked softly against felt. Glasses clinked. Low laughter filled the room like smoke. Then the door creaked open. The sound shouldn't have mattered. No one walked into Santoro's back room uninvited. Ever. But it did matter. Conversation died instantly. A girl stood in the doorway. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Her coat was too thin for a New York winter, sleeves frayed at the cuffs. Her sneakers were scuffed white at the toes, worn down from walking too far, too often. Brown hair pulled into a crooked ponytail, loose strands clinging to her cheeks. But it was her eyes that stopped them cold. They weren't afraid. They were steady. Old. She stepped inside like she had every right to be there. One of the capos shifted in his chair, hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. Another straightened, jaw tightening. A third set his glass down slowly, never taking his eyes off the girl. Nico raised one hand. Slight. Deliberate. No one spoke. The girl walked straight to the table. Straight to him. She stopped 3 feet away and looked directly at Nico's forearm, where the cuff of his suit had slid back just enough to reveal ink. A tattoo. Old. Faded. A black serpent coiled around a dagger, crowned at the hilt. The room felt like it lost oxygen. The girl lifted her small wrist, pointing. "I've seen that before," she said softly. Nico's jaw tightened. His eyes never left hers. "Where?" he asked, voice low and careful. She swallowed once, then spoke the words that shattered 20 years of silence. "My father had that same tattoo." 8 capos froze. A glass slipped from someone's fingers and cracked against the floor. Nico stood slowly, the chair scraping behind him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Elena," she said.
Elena Jones.
The name meant nothing. The tattoo meant everything. One of the older capos whispered, barely audible over the hum of the ceiling fan.
Impossible.
Nico crouched until they were eye level. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than anyone in that room had heard in years. "Who is your father, Elena?" Her fingers curled into the fabric of her coat. "His name was Marco Jones," she said, voice wavering but holding. "But he told me before he died that his real name in your world was Il Serpente." The air turned heavy. A man crossed himself. Another leaned back, as if struck. Nico closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose.
Il Serpente.
The serpent. A ghost from 20 years ago. And now his daughter was standing in front of him, asking questions no child should have to ask. Nico stared at the tattoo on his own forearm like he was seeing it for the first time. The serpent coiled tight around the blade, scales rendered in black ink that had faded to blue-gray over the decades. The crown sat at the hilt, 7 points, each one representing a burrow, a promise, a blood oath that most men didn't live long enough to regret breaking. It wasn't just ink. It was a mark that meant you'd stood in rooms where empires were built and destroyed. It meant you'd earned your place through loyalty that couldn't be bought or faked. And it meant you were never truly free. "That mark," one of the capos said quietly, a man called Salvatore with hands like tree roots, "hasn't been given out in 20 years. Nico didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Elena. "When did your father die?" he asked, voice stripped of everything except the question itself. 6 months ago, Elena said. "Cancer." A chair scraped loudly as another capo sat down hard, like his legs had stopped working. Nico nodded once, slow. Then he straightened and turned to face the table. "Tommaso," he said to a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses. "You remember Marco?" Tommaso's face had gone pale.
Il Serpente?
"Nico, that's not possible." He left. Another capo interrupted, voice rough. This one was younger, maybe 50, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "Walked away. We thought he was dead." "We hoped he was dead," Salvatore muttered. "Better than thinking he just abandoned." "Enough." Nico's voice cut through the room like a blade. He looked back at Elena, studying her face with the intensity of a man searching for proof in the angles of her nose, the set of her jaw, the way she stood with her shoulders back despite everything. "Your father," Nico said carefully, "was one of us. More than that, he was one of my most trusted men.
For 15 years, he stood at my right hand.
He knew things that could have buried us all." Elena's fingers were trembling now, but her voice stayed steady. "He told me not to say that word out loud. He said if things ever got bad, I should look for the men who wear the serpent and the crown." She reached into her coat pocket. Every man in the room tensed. Elena pulled out a folded photograph, edges worn soft from handling, and held it out to Nico. He took it with fingers that shook just slightly. 8 men leaned forward. The photograph showed them all younger, harder, standing outside a warehouse in Brooklyn that didn't exist anymore. Marco, il Serpente, stood at Nico's right shoulder, arms slung around him, grinning like the world couldn't touch him. His other hand held a cigarette, and the same tattoo was visible on his forearm, fresh and dark. Nico turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting that was thin and shaky, the letters uneven from a hand that could barely hold the pen. "If you need help, find Nico. He keeps his promises. Dad." The room was silent except for the ceiling fan and someone's labored breathing. Nico looked up at Elena, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt something close to fear. Not of violence, not of rivals or betrayals or federal agents. Fear that he wouldn't be able to keep the promise Marco had believed he would. "Why are you here, Elena?" Elena's shoulders sagged like she'd been holding herself together through sheer will, and the question finally broke through. "My mom is sick," she whispered. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. "She can't work anymore. She's got something wrong with her lungs and she can't breathe right, and the doctors say she needs surgery, but it costs so much money, and we don't have insurance because she lost her job when she got too sick to go in, and our landlord." Her voice cracked. "Our landlord says we're getting evicted. He comes by and yells at her and calls us trash, and he scares me, and I didn't know what else to do." She stopped, chest heaving, tears streaming down her face now. "And there's a man," she continued, voice dropping to something small and terrified. "He comes around at night asking questions about my dad, about where he worked, who he knew, if he left anything behind. My mom tells him to go away, but he keeps coming back, and I'm scared he's going to hurt her." The room was silent. Not the threatening silence from before. Something heavier. Older men confronting the weight of choices made decades ago, consequences they'd never considered coming home in the shape of a 9-year-old girl. Salvatore's jaw worked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find words. Tommaso removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his eyes. The scarred capo looked at Nico with an expression that said, "We have to do something." Nico raised his hand again.
Slowly. "Out," he said.
No one questioned him. They stood, chairs scraping, and filed toward the door. Salvatore squeezed Elena's shoulder as he passed, gentle, grandfatherly. Tommaso nodded to her like she was someone who mattered.
The door closed.
The room felt larger without them, emptier, just Nico and Elena and the ghost of Marco Jones hanging between them like smoke. Nico walked around the table and knelt in front of her, one knee on the scarred wood floor, until they were eye level. Up close, Elena could see every line in his face, every scar, every year. She could also see something she hadn't expected, kindness. "You did the right thing," Nico said quietly. "Coming here. finding us. Your father trusted us with his life more than once. That means we trust you. That means your family. Elena's chin trembled. I don't want to be trouble. You're not trouble, sweetheart. You're his daughter. That makes you blood. And blood doesn't beg for help. Blood asks and we answer. He placed a careful hand on her shoulder, the same way Marco used to when she was scared of thunderstorms or bad dreams or things she couldn't name. Your father walked away from this life because he wanted you to be safe, Nico said. He wanted you to grow up without this shadow hanging over you. And we respected that choice even when it hurt. Even when we thought he'd abandoned us. His grip tightened just slightly. But he didn't abandon you. He left you a map. He left you us. Nico stood, his knees cracking, and looked down at Elena with eyes that had ordered terrible things but right now held only certainty. Tonight, everything changes. Within 48 hours, Elena and her mother vanished from their Queens apartment like they'd never existed. No moving trucks. No forwarding address.
Just gone.
The brownstones sat on a quiet tree-lined street in Brooklyn, 3 stories of red brick and white trim, owned through enough shell companies that no one could trace it back to anyone who mattered. The front door had new locks. The windows had curtains that someone's wife had picked out, cream-colored, letting in soft morning light. Inside, the rooms were furnished simply but completely. A real bed with a headboard for Elena's mother. A smaller room for Elena with a desk by the window and bookshelves already filled with novels someone thought a 9-year-old should read. Doctors arrived the next morning. Not from hospitals, but from private practices where questions weren't asked and payments came in cash. They examined Elena's mother in the upstairs bedroom, speaking in low voices about medications and treatment plans and specialists in Manhattan who owed favors. By the second day, the medical bills, 3 months of accumulating notices stamped in red, simply disappeared. The eviction notice, the threats, the calls from collection agencies, erased. The man who'd been asking questions about Marco Jones left the city on a Tuesday afternoon.
He didn't come back.
No one asked where he went. No one needed to. Nico started visiting every Sunday. He'd arrive mid-morning with a white bakery box filled with cannoli from a place in Little Italy that had been there since before he was born. He'd sit at the kitchen table with Elena while her mother rested upstairs, and they'd talk about small things, school, homework, books she was reading. Sometimes he'd help her with math. His hands, scarred and thick-knuckled, would hold a pencil carefully as he walked her through problems about fractions and percentages. Your father was good at numbers, Nico said once, not looking up from the homework. Kept everything in his head. Never wrote anything down. Safer that way. Elena watched him. Why did he leave? Nico set the pencil down and leaned back in his chair. Because he loved your mother more than he loved the life. And because he knew, he paused, choosing words carefully. He knew that men like us, we don't get to have families. Not really. Not the way normal people do. There's always a price. Always someone coming for what you've built. He wanted me to be safe, Elena said quietly. He wanted you to be free. Nico met her eyes. There's a difference. The Capos met without Elena, in the same back room where she'd first found them. Salvatore poured whiskey into short glasses. Tommaso lit a cigarette. The scarred one, they called him Frankie, stood by the window watching the street. We're protecting the daughter of a man who abandoned us, Frankie said finally. He didn't abandon anyone. Nico's voice was flat. He chose.
There's honor in that.
Honor? Salvatore shook his head. Nico, he walked away from everything we built, from every promise he made. To keep one bigger promise, Tommaso said quietly, smoke curling from his lips. To his family. The room fell silent. Nico stood, walking to the window beside Frankie. Power isn't just what you take, he said. It's what you choose not to use. Marco understood that. He could have stayed, could have fought for position, but he saw further than the rest of us. He saw what it would cost. He turned to face them. True strength is restraint. And, right now, keeping that little girl safe? That's the strongest thing we can do. Years passed the way they always do, slowly, then all at once. Elena's mother recovered. Not completely, Never completely, but enough to work again, to breathe without pain, to watch her daughter grow up with something close to peace. Elena herself transformed from a frightened 9-year-old into something stronger. She studied hard, earned good grades, learned to carry herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was protected but never said it out loud. At her 8th grade graduation, 3 men in expensive suits sat in the back row. Salvatore's hair had gone completely white. Tommaso's glasses were thicker now. Frankie's scar had faded, but never disappeared. They didn't clap louder than anyone else, didn't draw attention. But when Elena crossed the stage to accept her diploma, she looked back and found them, and they nodded once. High school came and went the same way. College acceptance letters arrived in the spring of her senior year. Good schools, expensive schools, the kind of places that should have been impossible for a girl from a brownstone in Brooklyn with a single mother. The tuition bills never came. Someone always handled it. Elena never asked who. Nico's health began to fail when she turned 16. Nothing dramatic at first. Just small things. His hands shook more when he poured coffee. His breath came shorter when he climbed stairs. The silver in his hair spread until there was no dark left. He still visited, but less frequently now. Once a month instead of every week. Then every other month. One Sunday afternoon in October, Elena found him sitting on the front steps of the brownstone, staring at the street like he was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. She sat beside him without a word. "I've been thinking about your father," Nico said finally. "About the choice he made."
Elena waited.
"We resented him for it," Nico continued, voice rough. "Thought he was weak. Thought he'd betrayed us for a woman and a life that didn't matter." He shook his head slowly. "We were wrong. You kept your promise to him," Elena said quietly. "That's what matters. He kept his promise to you first." Nico looked at her, and his eyes were tired in a way that went deeper than age. He saw what we couldn't. That this life, it takes more than it gives. It demands everything and leaves you with ghosts. He paused, thumb rubbing against the faded tattoo on his forearm. "Your father saved more than one life by leaving," Nico said. "He saved yours. He saved your mother's. And maybe," his voice caught, "maybe he saved mine too. Because you reminded us what we were supposed to protect." The call came on a Tuesday morning in January. Nico had collapsed at Santoro's. Heart attack, the doctors said. Not fatal, but close. Too close. Elena found him in a private room at Mount Sinai, monitors beeping steadily, oxygen tube running to his nose. He looked smaller in the hospital bed. Mortal in a way she'd never seen before. The Capos were already there. Salvatore sat in the corner, hands clasped between his knees. Tommaso stood by the window, staring out at nothing. Frankie leaned against the wall, arms crossed, jaw tight with something that looked like fear. "He's been asking for you," Salvatore said quietly when Elena entered. She pulled a chair beside the bed and took Nico's hand. His skin was thin, papery, cool to the touch. His eyes opened slowly.
"Anna."
His voice was weak, but steady. "You came." "Of course I came." Over the following months, Elena became what Nico had once been for her. A constant presence. She visited him 3 times a week, then 4, then nearly every day as his strength continued to fade. The Capos aged around him like trees losing leaves. Salvatore moved slower now, using a cane he pretended was just for show. Tommaso's hands shook when he lit cigarettes. Frankie's scar had gone white, stretched across skin that sagged where it used to be tight. They were becoming what they'd always feared. Old men with regrets. One afternoon, Nico waved the others out of the room. When they were alone, he looked at Elena with eyes that had lost none of their sharpness despite everything else failing. "We were wrong about your father," he said. "All those years, we thought he'd betrayed the family. Thought he'd chosen the easy path." Elena squeezed his hand. "But he chose the hardest thing a man can do," Nico continued. "He walked away from power, from brotherhood, from everything he knew, because he loved you more. That's not weakness. That's strength we never had." "You had it," Elena said softly. "You showed it every Sunday, when you came with cannoli. Every time you helped with my homework. Every time you chose to protect instead of punish. Nico's eyes filled. He didn't wipe them. Your forgiveness means more than you know. There's nothing to forgive. You kept your promise. All of you did. He gripped her hand tighter, surprising strength in those failing fingers. When I'm gone, he said, remember the truth about your father. Not the myth. Not Serpente, the legend. Remember Marco, the man who loved his daughter enough to disappear. Nico died on a Sunday morning in March, the same day of the week he'd spent years bringing cannoli to a little girl who'd walked into his life, carrying a ghost. The funeral filled every pew at St. Anthony's in Little Italy and spilled out onto the sidewalk. Men in black suits lined the street 3 deep, faces that had seen everything and revealed nothing, standing in silent formation like soldiers at attention. They came from every borough. From New Jersey and Philadelphia. From cities where Nico's name still meant something, where his word had been law, where his handshake had sealed deals worth millions. Underworld royalty, all of them. Inside the church, the coffin sat closed beneath stained glass windows that scattered colored light across dark wood. White lilies covered every surface. The air smelled like incense and old prayers. Elena sat in the front row between her mother and Salvatore. She wore black, her hands folded in her lap, the photograph tucked carefully in her coat pocket. The priest spoke about redemption and sacrifice and the mercy of God. His words echoed off vaulted ceilings, formal and distant, the kind of eulogy given for men whose real lives couldn't be spoken aloud in sacred spaces. When it was time, Salvatore stood and helped Elena to her feet. She walked to the coffin on legs that felt like water. Her hands shook as she pulled out the photograph, the one that had started everything. Young Nico and her father, arms around each other, grinning like the world was theirs to take. The serpent and crown visible on both their forearms, promises made in ink and blood. She placed it gently on the closed lid. Thank you, she whispered, for keeping your promise, for remembering who he was, for protecting us when we had nothing. Behind her, 800 people stood.
Not because they were told to, because they wanted to.
Tommaso stepped forward first, his voice carrying through the church despite its age and roughness. Elena Jones is family, he said. Daughter of Serpente. Under our protection. Always. Salvatore moved beside him. Then Frankie. Then others, Capos from different territories, different generations, men who'd never agreed on anything standing united in this single moment. Anyone who threatens her, Salvatore said, his voice iron despite the cane he leaned on, threatens all of us. The church filled with a sound like distant thunder, 800 voices murmuring agreement. The organization wasn't bowing to power. It was bowing to honor. To a promise kept by a dying man. To a little girl who'd been brave enough to walk into hell and ask for help. To a father who'd given up everything so his daughter could be free. Elena turned to face them, tears streaming down her face. And every man in that church lowered his head. Elena graduated college with honors 3 years later. Business degree, full scholarship, a future built on foundations laid by men who'd never seen the inside of a classroom but understood the value of education in ways their own lives had taught them. She got a job at an accounting firm in Manhattan. Worked her way up, made a life that had nothing to do with back rooms or whispered deals or promises sealed in blood. She met someone, a teacher named David who knew nothing about her past and didn't need to. He loved her for who she was, not who her father had been or who had protected her. They married on a Saturday in spring at the same church where Nico had been laid to rest. Salvatore walked her down the aisle, his cane clicking against marble, tears streaming openly down his weathered face. Tommaso and Frankie sat in the front row. They were the last 3. The others had faded one by one, the way old men do. Heart attacks and strokes and cancers that modern medicine couldn't stop. Each funeral smaller than Nico's, but no less respectful. Each one attended by fewer men in dark suits, the organization itself aging, changing, becoming something different than what it had been. Elena had children, 2 daughters and a son. She raised them in a brownstone in Brooklyn that she'd bought with money she'd earned herself, though everyone knew the down payment had come from somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't ask for repayment. She taught them about kindness, about keeping promises, about the difference between power and strength. She never taught them about violence. On Sundays, she'd take them to visit the old men. Salvatore would tell stories about their grandfather, the real stories, not the myths. About Marco the man, not Il, Serpente the legend. About how he'd made the hardest choice a father could make. He gave up everything, Salvatore would say, his voice thin but steady, so you could have everything. The children would listen with wide eyes, not quite understanding but sensing something important in the words. Salvatore died when Elena was 32. Tommaso followed 6 months later. Frankie held on another year, stubborn until the end. At each funeral, Elena stood and spoke about honor, about men who'd kept promises made to a ghost, about how the truest measure of power isn't what you take, but what you choose to protect. The organization continued without them, but it wasn't the same. Younger men took over, men who hadn't known Marco or Nico, or what it meant to sacrifice everything for a promise. But the stories remained. In quiet corners of Queens and Brooklyn, in social clubs where old men played cards and drank espresso, they still told the tale of Il Serpente, the man who walked away, and of his daughter, who walked into a room full of monsters and reminded them they were still human. Promises kept echo longer than threats ever do. Elena's oldest daughter found the photograph when she was 11, tucked in a drawer beneath old tax returns and birth certificates. "Mom," she called from the bedroom.
Who are these people?
Elena looked up from the kitchen table where she'd been helping her son with homework. She walked to the bedroom and saw her daughter holding the faded photograph, young Nico and Marco, arms around each other, the serpent and crown visible on their forearms. She sat on the edge of the bed and took the photograph carefully. "That's your grandfather," she said, pointing to Marco. "And that's the man who saved our family." Her 3 children gathered around, the youngest climbing onto her lap. "What's that on their arms?" her son asked, tracing the tattoo with one small finger against the photograph. Elena was quiet for a moment, choosing her words the way Nico had taught her, carefully, truthfully. "It's a mark that meant they were brothers. Not by blood, but by choice. It meant they'd protect each other no matter what." "Like superheroes?" her youngest asked.
Elena smiled softly.
"Not quite. They were just men. Flawed men who made mistakes and hurt people and did things I hope you never have to understand." She looked at each of her children. "But they also kept their promises. When I was your age, when we had nothing, when we were scared and alone, these men, these brothers, they remembered my father. They remembered what loyalty meant. And they protected us." "Because of the tattoo?" her daughter asked. "Because of what the tattoo represented," Elena corrected gently. "Not power, not fear, but family. The kind you choose. The kind that shows up when you need them most." Her son looked up at her with serious eyes. "Would you get that tattoo?" Elena shook her head. "I don't need to. The promise is already written here." She touched her chest, over her heart. "Your grandfather taught me that real strength isn't about control or violence. It's about choosing love over pride. It's about walking away from power to protect the people you care about." She stood, placing the photograph on the dresser where her children could see it. "Remember this, power fades. Empires crumble. Threats are forgotten. But promises," she looked at each of them, "promises kept with honor, with sacrifice, with love, those echo forever." Her youngest tugged her sleeve. "Will you tell us more stories about grandfather?" Elena smiled, the same smile Marco had given her before cancer took him, the same smile Nico had worn when he brought cannoli on Sunday mornings. "Yes," she said. "I'll tell you the truth. Not the legend." And in that moment, in a brownstone in Brooklyn far from back rooms and dark deals, the real legacy lived on, not in ink or blood, but in the values passed from one generation to the next. The serpent and crown had meant power once. Now they meant something better: protection, sacrifice, and the kind of love that doesn't end when the powerful fall. In the long memory of New York, in the quiet corners where old stories are told, people still speak of Il Serpente, the man who loved his daughter enough to disappear, and of the men who honored that love long after he was gone. Not monsters. Just men who learned, in the end, what really matters. If this story reminded you that family isn't always blood, that promises matter more than power, and that the hardest choices are often the most honorable ones, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about loyalty, sacrifice, and the people who show up when it matters most. Turn on notifications so you never miss a tale of honor in unlikely places. Drop a comment about the promises that shaped your life, the family you chose, or the moment someone showed up for you when no one else would. Because these stories,
They're not just about the past.
they're about remembering what we're supposed to protect.